I'm starting out with a thesis, and that is that we know more about who school shooters are than what we're maximizing. We know more about who they are than we're using. Is that a fair statement?
I do think that's a very fair statement. In looking at school shooters and sort of attempted school shooters, you see these really consistent patterns in who these individuals are and what their pathway to violence looks like. And we're not building systems to interrupt that pathway yet.
That to me is a very hopeful reality, but it's also frustrating in that we're not doing it, but I'm making plans for that to change. That's why I'm so anxious to talk about it. The truth is, we don't have a psychological test. We don't have a psychometric. We don't have a battery of tests that we can give to all of the school kids that will identify who the school shooter is going to be. Fair statement?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, there's not a profile in that typical sense of the word. We think of it more as a pathway toward violence. And it's a pathway that you see over and over and over again. And that comes back to that frustration you talked about, which is when you're able to look back with retrospect and say, why weren't these warning signs spotted? Why weren't they acted upon? So we're really hopeful now that we can turn sort of this retrospective look into actually a more hopeful, forward-looking intervention plan to prevent violence going forward.
Let's think about this for a minute because we're going to get into what these things are and talk about them in some detail. But some of the first things we know are that we're talking mostly about males, correct?
Yes. So in our database of mass shooters, it's 98% male. I think there's 4 women in there, but 2 of them committed the shooting with a man. So vast majority male.
Okay. Let's talk about age.
So if we're talking about school shooters, they're young, 15, 16 on average, up to 18. Over 90% of them are actually current or former students of the school.
Okay, and that's what I want to do first is talk about school shooters, and
Yep.
then we'll broaden this out a little bit. But right now, we're talking about 98% are males, really 99 plus, I suppose. Like you say, there's 2 girls in here, but they were with a male. 15 to 18, you say 98% of these are either current or former students of the school where the shooting takes place, correct?
About 90% of them, yes.
90%?
Yep.
Okay.
And if we're just talking school shooters, we can actually say 100% male.
Okay, 100% male then. Let's talk about what that means. Let's pick a hypothetical school that's 50% male, 50% female. We can immediately divide our target population of who we're having to focus on in half, correct?
Yep.
Let's say we've got 1,000 students in the school. We could immediately divide it in half, so we're now talking about 500. And if we know that they're of a certain age, we can then bracket it down even further, correct?
Yeah, it's mostly high school students. So
Right.
you are focused then at the older end of that student body, and yeah, it's boys that we're focused on.
So we're bracketing it down even more. Now, we also know some other things about them, and let's talk about what those are because you guys, you're not the only ones that have researched this. You're just the most thorough, consistent, and meticulous about it. But your research has been validated by others, and it's very consistent. So we know other things about them personality-wise and home-wise. So describe that for our listeners and viewers, if you would, please.
Yeah, we see a common pathway with this trajectory toward violence, and it often is rooted in early childhood trauma. So these are young people who've experienced at times quite horrific abuse and neglect early in life, and it's unresolved. Because there's many people in the world that have experienced trauma, but it doesn't mean to say that they're going to go on to perpetrate a school shooting. But in this particular case, it's trauma that's unresolved, and it lays a foundation for what we call a crisis point in the lives of these students. So they reach an identifiable crisis, and it's noticeable. It's a change in their behavior from the norm. And you see in the sort of transcripts of the investigations that follow school shootings, people will talk about that they knew that something was wrong. They had a gut feeling. They could notice a change in behavior. It was increased aggression or agitation, or they were becoming more withdrawn. It was something that alerted people that there was something not quite right, but they didn't really put together two and two and realize that this was potentially the signs that violence was to follow. So it's early childhood trauma and it's a crisis point are two of the really foundational pieces of this puzzle.
Also, they tend to be suicidal, so that school shootings are often designed to be a final act, that they're often kind of isolated. They spend a lot of time studying previous shooters. They spend a lot of times online in chat rooms getting radicalized and getting their violence validated. And they leak their plans. They tell other people, usually students, that they're thinking about doing this.
Right. 80-something% of them tell at least one person. 2/3 of them tell more than one person. You mentioned something earlier. You said they reach this crisis point and they have identifiable, observable mental health symptoms, either psychological, behavioral, something that's noticeable. It's not like this comes out of the blue. The kids that know them, they don't call it this, but they have a baseline for this individual. There's a baseline where they can say something's varied. This kid is different now than he was a month ago or before the Christmas break or before he left for summer break. This kid's come back in September or January, February, which is usually when this happens, right? When they come back from break. We're in that time now in September when these things occur the most. So there's something observable. We've got something that is a variation from baseline. So if they're looking for it, then they can say, okay, something's amiss here, something's gone wrong. And if this is a red flag, if this is something that somebody knows what to do with when they see that, that causes some investigation into the other areas, then we know that some investigation can start. And again, I'm talking about narrowing the field. These aren't the kids that are the soloist in the choir. They're not the kids that are on the debate team, the football team, the class president, the popular kids. These are already marginalized kids that set themselves apart from the rest of the group. Fair?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Okay, I've talked to so many educators and I've talked to some legislators recently, and they say there are so many out there. How do we start to narrow this down? And there are ways to narrow it down. You cut it in half because it's boys, not girls. You can get to high school and you're talking about the certain age. Then you're talking about those that have a noticeable departure from baseline. And if that sets into play where you start looking to see, do they have early childhood trauma? Have they hit a crisis point? And you start investigating and see they are studying shooters, they have become radicalized, then you find out that on their Instagram, social media, or however they've started to talk about doing something, they're writing a manifesto or whatever. Now these people start identifying themselves where they stick out like a sore thumb if you know what you're looking for.
Exactly. And I think two things happen. One is that we think of people who do this as these outside monsters, right? It's like this boogeyman, psychopath person that comes in and does that. We don't think of school shooters as insiders, right? There's students who go to that school. They are kids in the classroom. And so even when people are giving off all these warning signs, they're talking about their plans, they're talking about violence, people don't take the warning signs seriously because they couldn't imagine that the kid sitting next to them in class could actually do this. So that's kind of a mind shift to think somebody I know could actually be the one that does this. And then second, I think people are afraid to report. They don't want to be a snitch. They don't want to get the kid put in prison or expelled from school. So we have to build systems where students can trust that they can go to adults and they'll get an outcome that they're looking for.